Page 290, auscultation. This is a pretty nuanced slide. There's a lot of words on it. It's really not as challenging as it looks, but it definitely looks overwhelming. You know, you get all these lines, you get all these words, you get all these things in bold, all these colors, all these arrows and all this stuff, and you've got this fucking diagram here, this chart you have to look at and figure. So it can definitely be overwhelming, but take my word for it, in the next 5, 6, 7 minutes, it's going to be a lot more straightforward. The first thing you got to quickly just recognize is just kind of look at where you're seeing things, second intercostal space, looking at where your valves are. Everything here is labeled for a very specific reason, because you're going to get asked on the test, right second intercostals, and you'll have to know, oh, that's the aortic area. Oh, that's the aortic area. All right. And then something else that's you're not really going to get tested on, but it's actually really good to know, and it's the valve positions relative to where you actually hear everything, right? So the mitral area, you hear a lot of things great right here, but that's not really where the mitral valve is, you know? So, whatever. That's just for your benefit. But in any case, let's start off with the top here. A good rule of thumb is that when someone says stenosis, it typically happens at that valve area. So for example, aortic stenosis, it's here at the aortic area. Pulmonic stenosis, right here at the pulmonary area. Tricuspid stenosis, well, it's right there at the tricuspid area. Mitral stenosis, same thing. It's right here in the mitral area. Okay, really cool. The next step is just understanding which one of them are systolic, which one of them are diastolic. Okay. Well, the reason why why aortic stenosis is a systolic murmur, it's because you have things from the left ventricle getting pushed out through the aortic valve, and of course, when the left ventricle contracts, I mean that's systolic. That's systole. And so, obviously, things going through the mitral valve, it's pretty big during diastole. So when it's having trouble going through, like mitral stenosis, it'll be diastolic. All right, so we can kind of cross out a lot of these things so far. Boom, aortic stenosis, aortic valve sclerosis, which is essentially pretty similar to aortic stenosis. So we can also cross that off. Pulmonic stenosis, tricuspid stenosis, mitral stenosis, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So what are the other big ones? Really, these are the big ones here. I mean, also recognizing hollow systolic murmurs. You got to think of mitral regurgitation. And an important thing to understand the difference between is mitral regurgitation and mitral valve prolapse. And mitral valve prolapse really has to do with this here, really has to do with the chordae tendineae. Whereas mitral regurgitation has to do with just a messed up valve. Now sometimes they go hand in hand, but they're two different things. And when we talk about the different murmurs, it's going to start making a lot of sense in terms of the pathology and how it relates to the murmurs. And all these things here, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, septal defects and stuff, I'll talk about those right here when I talk about different maneuvers and the effect that it has on the murmurs. So Valsalva Maneuver, everyone kind of knows what that is. You kind of bear down. Another thing to do Valsalva Maneuver is you can just blow on your thumb. That also works. The idea is that here you're increasing intrathoracic pressure. You can literally feel it when you bear down. And of course, much like the opposite of inspiration, where you decrease intrathoracic pressure and you allow a bunch of stuff to go into the right atrium. When you increase intrathoracic pressure, you decrease the amount of stuff going into the right atrium. You can kind of think of it like, this is a not real diagram, but you know, if this is the right atrium right here, and you increase the amount of pressure in it, well, then you're going to have a hard time getting stuff to go inside, right? It's kind of going to get blocked off. Alright, so, and then the next thing, passive leg raise. Well, of course that's going to increase preload. You're literally just dumping all the blood that's in your legs, in the veins, back into the right side of the heart. This one's pretty good squatting, specifically because it's also going to increase the preload. In this sense, it's you have less. It's kind of weird. You have less distance, kind of going up. In the sense that when you're standing, your veins have to travel all the way up your legs and then up to the right side of your heart. Whereas if you're a little bit lower when you're squatting, it doesn't have to do as much work against gravity. However, you do have an increase in afterload. And just a reminder, afterload is the work that the left ventricle has to go against. And the reason why you have an increase in afterload is literally because when you squat, you know, when you're standing, your legs are kind of just straight, right? And when you squat, they're like this. And this area right here, you really have compression of those arteries. You have a compression of that vascular system. And so it's harder to push against it just because it eventually turns into resistance against the left ventricular outflow tract. All right? And hand grip for the same thing. You have an increase in the afterload. Okay. And of course, inspiration, kind of the opposite of the Valsalva maneuver. You have a decrease in intrathoracic pressure, so you have an increase in the venous return to the right heart. Okay, fantastic, fantastic. So let's talk about now murmurs that increase with this maneuver. Okay, so mitral valve prolapse is going to increase with this maneuver. Why is that? Well, the reason why is actually more intuitive if you talk about maneuvers that decrease first. So let's talk about this one first, and that'll answer this one. All right, so things like passive leg raises, when you're just flooding the heart full of blood. Here. You've got these things on your valves called the chordae tendineae, and they're kind of holding your valve in place. When the left ventricle is full, the chordae tendineae are nice and relaxed. However, when it's not full, the chordae tendineae are very taut, and that's what causes the prolapse, and that's what causes the sound. In a similar way, in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, right? So if you remember hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, especially hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, what you have is a left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. And it's kind of interesting. You can kind of think of it like this or something, right? We'll say something like this, right? So for whatever reason, blood's trying to get through here. And you can tell it's kind of, you know, tight. And so when you don't have a lot of blood, you're going to have a very loud murmur because you're going to have all this blood trying to get into this little space that's really hard. And so you're going to have a murmur. However, when you have a whole bunch of blood, as you would have on inspiration, as you would have with passive leg raises, what you're going to see is that you have all this blood that's now pushing away this little obstruction, and it's allowing all the blood to now flow more freely through this left ventricular outflow tract that was once obstructed. So again, because here, passive leg raise, things like squatting, okay? Because you're able to now have all this blood literally buoy this previously obstructed outflow tract, you don't have the murmur anymore. And similarly in mitral valve prolapse, because you now have your chordae tendineae, which are no longer taut and they're nice and relaxed, you don't have this murmur anymore. And so consequently, you know, the opposite applies when you do the opposite. When you're decreasing the preload, well, you're pretty much doing this to the left ventricular outflow tract. You're pretty much doing this to the chordae tendineae. All right, so there you go. What else? Hand grip. Why does hand grip decrease aortic stenosis? This is a fantastic kind of little thinking thing. So aortic stenosis, and they kind of give you a hint when they say you decrease the transaortic valve pressure gradient. So if you remember that what afterload is it's the resistance going against the left ventricle, right? You can kind of already think that, you know, if you're trying to get things from the left ventricle, and this is such a bad diagram, guys, I'm sorry. If you're trying to get things from the left ventricle, you know, and we'll say for whatever reason, this is the aortic valve, you know, up into the aorta, right? And then you have an increase in your afterload, meaning you have increased resistance, increased work that the left ventricle has to go against. You can kind of see by the magnitude and direction of these arrows that if you have your left ventricle trying to push things against this stenosed aortic valve, and if you have an increase in the work going against this left ventricle, it's kind of going to cancel it out. And like most things where you have a decrease in a pressure gradient, you don't have as much flow. So when you have this hand grip action right here, where you're increasing the afterload, you're essentially not letting a lot of blood go through the stenosed valve. And what happens then is that, well, you know, you're not going to be able to, you know, move blood. You're not going to have that murmur. Okay. And then why does hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, why does this murmur decrease when you have a hand grip maneuver, when you have an increase in the afterload? Well, the reason is the same reason here. You're not able to get all of this blood out. And so you have an increase in the volume of the left ventricle. Kind of here, remember? It kind of pushes against the obstruction of the outflow tract. Way cool, way cool. And then right here, the hand grip, how it increases things like ventricular septal defects. Well, this kind of goes hand in hand, with what we've been talking about here with the aortic stenosis, with increasing the afterload. So in a ventricular septal defect, so here's the left ventricle, here's the right ventricle. Well, what ends up happening is, as you know, you've got a bunch of blood getting shunted from the left ventricle to the right ventricle, hence septal defect. All right, but as we all know, in the left ventricle, you eventually want to go out to the aorta, right? However, if this pathway is blocked, you know, everything's just going to get shunted this way. And so now you have a whole bunch more stuff getting shunted through this ventricular septal defect, which is causing, you know, that's why you've got the increase in the murmur. Same thing with mitral regurgitation. You know, you're not able to pump as much stuff through the mitral valve, and as a result, well, hold on. Let me rephrase that. When you pump things through the mitral valve, you kind of expect it to then go from the ventricle to the aorta. But again, if this pathway from the ventricle to the aorta is blocked, then it's just going to regurgitate back. Same concept, slightly different application. And then the same thing with aortic regurgitation. You know, if you're, we're going to do this right here. If you have things in the left ventricle getting pushed out through the aorta, but once it starts getting pushed out, you have this increase in afterload, meaning you have resistance to everything moving this way. Well, then shit, things are just going to move back. And in an aortic regurgitation murmur, I mean, things just move back. So there you go. Not that bad. I'm sorry it took more than the 7 minutes, but you know, I think this is, if you understand this, then you really understand literally all of these things. And it'll be pretty hard to fool you.